Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and welcome to the Future of Education. It is the 27th of November 2012, and our special guest is Charles Hayes. Charles, welcome.
Thank you.
Really delighted to have you here. We'll tell a story or two when we get started about how that came about. The Future of Education is a Web 2.0 Labs project. Thanks to Mighty Bell and Blackboard Collaborate for support. I am also on my Hack Your Education tour, which may or may not come up tonight. I think it might, but basically an attempt to build a narrative around education that takes back the topic of learning. The Global Education Conference, although not indicated on the slide, has actually occurred. And the 425 sessions over the course of 5 days are all up in recorded form and available for anybody to listen to. Really delighted to have had that event go so well. Also, the archives of the Future of Libraries Conference and the Learning 2.0 Conference are available at those websites. And I am in La Cañada, Flint Ridge, California. Hack Your Education is in Los Angeles this weekend. Thanks, Carolyn, for asking. Coming up on the Future of Education on Thursday night, Jim Groom is going to talk about the program he's running called A Domain of One's Own. So excited about that show. On December 6th, Ray McNulty will talk about his book, It's Not Us Again, It's Them, Creating the Schools We Need. Cal Newport comes back on the 13th to talk about his new book, So Good They Can't Ignore You, Why Skills Trump Passion in the Quest for the Work That You Love. Can't wait to hear Cal on this topic. The EduBlog Awards will probably be around the same date, but it can't be on the 13th because of that interview, but the EduBlog Awards will be that week at some point, broadcast live between the U.S. and Australia. Adam Fry comes on the show on the 18th to talk about EdTech entrepreneurism. This should be really interesting. Adam has been a hero of mine, building slowly and thoughtfully a great business in education that serves the customers well, serves schools well, serves students well, and is in many ways diametrically the opposite of the venture capital engagement taking place right now in educational technology. And then David Risher comes on in January to talk about World Reader, a fascinating program of getting books on e-readers out into the world. Also scheduling for 2013, John Hattie and Elliot Washer, which should be a lot of fun. If you've missed any of the shows, they are all recorded and up in full Illuminate Blackboard Collaborate versions and an MP3. I interviewed Kiran Birsetti from India this weekend. I had to do sort of very early hour, did not do that live, but that recording will be up tomorrow. And she is fascinating. Many of you have probably seen her TED Talk. We spent an hour talking about the program she's doing and giving youth agency. Those are my words, not hers. But really a fun interview, and can't wait for you to be able to hear that. Yael Wishnick before that talked to us about the culture of dependency versus a culture of success. Jamie McMillan on legendary learners, which was fascinating. That's a book I actually think Charles would love. Denise Pope from Stanford talked to us, Susie Boss before that on innovation. Kirsten Olson, who's mentioned in September University, her book, Wounded by School, came on the show, and many, many more. So over 300 shows all up there in recorded form. This is when those of you in the studio audience get to let us know where you're listening from. Look to the left of the map for a star. You double-click on that, and then you click on the map. Put in the chat maybe time, temperature, location. Looks like New Zealand, Australia, Mexico, United States, Canada. It's always so fun to see where people are listening from. And wherever you are, we're sure glad that you've chosen to join us. Oh, Anna, you're in Indonesia. Go ahead, Charles.
Hello?
I can hear you.
Yeah, okay.
I thought you had started to say something.
Oh, no. No. I'm in Wasilla, Alaska, by the way.
And I'm going to move my star to Alaska, having no idea where Wasilla, Alaska is.
Well, it's about 40 miles north of Anchorage.
Well, Charles is, well, we've got two in New Zealand. What a fun group. What a diverse group. Really delighted to have you here. Diversity will be a theme tonight. No doubt about that. Okay, so there is no Mighty Bell space for this show yet because Mighty Bell's been down in a server reboot, but I will look to put the resources up in Mighty Bell, and you can look for that later on the blog. So I want to tell quickly, Charles, the story of my reaching out to you. I've put up on the screen, which you can't see. Charles is coming in by telephone. The cover from Self University, and then the cover from September University, and then your photo. So I reached out to you originally about doing an interview on Self University, and I'm going to paraphrase your response, which was that you can barely stand to reread the lines of that book. It's so old. Has your thinking changed that much, or is it just hard to see things you wrote that long ago?
Well, I think my thinking has changed quite a bit, but I have a hard time with anything of mine that's dated. If the whole purpose of self-education is to keep learning, and so hopefully if you detest your earlier work, you've made some progress.
That's a great description. I guess I could say the same thing about my interview series. It's very hard for me to listen to the early interviews. So let me try. Go ahead.
I have never been able to listen to myself on the radio. I've been on quite a few radio programs, including Talk of the Nation, and they sent me a tape, but I have never been able to listen to myself because I'm too self-critical, I guess.
That is funny. So I want to paraphrase what I think the core message of September University is, and then I want you to correct me and allow us to sort of jump into that conversation. What I hear you saying is that we desperately need really good conversations and deep thinking at this time. The baby boomer generation is coming of maturity and are a generation that both have an inclination toward change and the potential to really make a difference by sheer numbers. And it's a challenge for them to step up and be adults because nothing much is at stake except the fate of civilization. How did I do?
You did very well. The baby boom generation, I was born in 1943, 3 years ahead of the baby boom generation. They've always been a step ahead of me. But their action during the days of the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights era, I just can't believe that these people are going to go away quietly. And in 2011, the first wave of the baby boom generation hit age 65, and somewhere around 10 or 12,000 people a day are hitting 65, and it's really, really early because this is going to continue until 2029.
But I think in the book you do express a little bit of fear that they will go away quietly. But is there a reason you think that those voices have not been as strong or as critically involved in public dialogue as they might have been?
Well, I think it's still very early. I mean, I think there's probably several years before we're really going to start reaping the benefit of it. But I will admit openly that I am worried. I mean, it's sort of like on even days I'm optimistic, and on odd days I'm pessimistic. There's so much going on in the world, and so much change, and so many uncertainties that. But I have a lot of faith in them. I mean, there's as many old fools as there are young ones, probably more. But there's something about reaching the age when you can see the end of your own life that it makes the things that are really important suddenly start to stand out. And if you have children and grandchildren, I don't think you can help but be very concerned about the years they're going to see that you won't.
So the book's argument really isn't about whether or not the generation will step up, but it's more that there is a need for a certain kind of discourse and dialogue, a certain way of looking at education that's critically important at this time in the world. Would that be fair?
Yes, it would be.
So tell us what an existential education is.
Well, I think primarily we are taught to become human doings and not human beings. I mean, we allow subjects like psychology and anthropology and sociology and history. We allow some of these subjects to be electives, and they're not electives unless you're not a human being. I mean, we desperately need to understand other cultures and other people. To put that, and we desperately need to understand ourselves to the best ability we can. I mean, knowing these things. I mean, I say in the book that psychologists still have mental problems and marriage counselors still get divorces, but learning, to me, enables us to dissipate existential angst, and it's just that simple.
Well, it may be simple to you, but I'm not even sure I fully understand that phrase. Learning allows us to dissipate existential acts. Do you mind breaking that down for a slow guy like me?
Well, I talk about in the book. I talk about what I call the existential triad, and that's the fear of death, the fear of others, and a lack of curiosity. And I think those three things. I mean, I pose them in a triangle, but I think those three things are sort of at the heart of existential angst. I mean, with the human condition comes the knowledge, whether it's suppressed, whether it's conscious or subconscious, that we're mortal human beings, and we spend an extraordinary amount of time trying to distract ourselves from that very notion, and it's easy to begin to associate uncertainty and other people and other things with that fear. I mean, the natural fear that comes with mortality, and so we distract ourselves and we bond ourselves together in our in groups by ratcheting up our angst at other people. And once you reach a critical amount of awareness about the validity of other people and other nations and other points of view, I just think it allows you an avenue of thinking and a way of releasing anxiety that you otherwise wouldn't have.
So as I was reading the book, I tried to sort of think in my own mind of what might have precipitated sort of our current state. And I know that from the interviews I'm doing and books that I look for, a lot of the material that has really resonated with me came from books in the 70s, self-directed learning, things like this. Is it fair to think that something happened between the 60s and the counterculture and the protests and the 70s and the views of schooling and opportunities to change schooling to sort of 2012 when it feels like there was this big gap that was just all about corporate growth and consumerism and increased equity?
Well, I don't think it's something that's happened quickly. I think it's happened so gradually that we don't even realize it's happened. To me, the world seems to be getting so superficial, the tweeting and texting and I mean, it's hard to make this clear without being confusing. But I mean, I have a lot of faith in young people. I think young people are smarter by orders of magnitude than my generation was when I was their age. But at the same time, I see young people today flitting around like subatomic particles because they're being tweeted and texted and with little bits of information when to my thinking, they need to spend a lot of time doing deep reading, and as a matter of fact, they balk at the idea of reading a novel or a long nonfiction book. So I think, I don't know. I mean, your question is profound, and I'm not sure exactly how to answer it.
Well, I'm going to use myself as an example, but as will become clear, not not just not an overly positive one. But I know that in our own raising of our children, we chose not to have a television for many, many years, and that really made a difference. And it also feels as though, the modeling of reading and deep thinking do transfer to your kids. But kids are different, and not every child responds the same way. But I look at this current generation of kids, and I wonder if we, their parents, don't actually have more responsibility than they do for not having set the example of deeper thinking.
Well, I think so, Steve. But still, to me, the peer group has so much more influence on young people than we think they do. I don't know if you read The Nurture Assumption by Judith Harris.
I didn't, but you mentioned it several times in the book.
Yeah. I think she makes a very good case that a lot of our training as parents can pretty easily go by the wayside, or it's discounted a lot more than we think it is. I'm saying that I would not recommend that people let up on that kind of parenting, but I just believe that peer pressure is vastly underestimated.
Okay, well, yeah, there's good commentary in the chat. I went through something about 5 years ago when I started participating in social media. So I'm going to give the counter story to the sort of the new technologies. And when I started to blog and do my interview series, I can only describe what I went through as being a cognitive revolution. It was as though my brain began to fire at levels that it hadn't before. And I was participating, and imperfectly as it was, I became an active contributor and creator by virtue of the social technologies. Is that phrase, a cognitive revolution, kind of what you're hoping people will go through?
Yeah, I think so. I think that the problems that we face have to be discussed, and people have to get involved. Every presidential election that for the last 20 years has seemed like the most important one in life, and it's not going to let up. It's going to keep that way too.
Well, let me extend on that a little, because it felt like the election cycle we just went through had more in common with the branding that would go on between Pepsi and Coca-Cola than it did around substantive issues. In fact, the things I cared about most weren't even discussed.
Yeah,
and what I hear you saying is the generation that's in a position to do so now has to become actively involved and start talking about these substantive issues.
Yeah, and I believe they are. I believe it just hasn't reached really audible terms yet. But I mean, there are an awful lot of positive things going on in the country, but they don't receive near as much attention as the negative ones.
Okay, so you have a great description in the book of how your thoughts come to light, and I'll let you describe that. But what I enjoyed sort of about the book as a whole was this sort of thinking about thinking and learning. And I wrote in the margins, a number of notes about ways in which I think. Like I realized in your description of how your thoughts come to light, that a piece that I go through that wasn't in that description is that those thoughts often come to me in conversation. They gestate, and then they bubble up, and then I hear myself say them to somebody, and I have to go write them down. Do you want to describe your thought process?
Yeah, well, whenever I become interested in the subject, I'll read everything I get my hands on and look in every source and think about it and brood about it for days, and then I'll begin to ask myself particular questions about it, and with the anticipation that I'm going to get some answers, and then I'll sort of let it go for a while, and then, like I say in the book, I can be taking a shower or paying a bill in a restaurant or something other, and all of a sudden I get a flash of insight into what I've been looking for, and I too have to write it down, or I will forget. But this thing is so powerful to me that for several days after it, I have a feeling of extended well-being. And my theory about that is I believe that whenever your knowledge in any subject reaches a critical mass in which a significant change or development causes a really cerebral shift that we have been created to get a great deal of pleasure out of it. And if you think about what life must have been like in prehistory in tribes around the world. I mean, if look at society, at the history of humankind on the planet from the beginning, if that were represented by a 12-inch ruler, the times that we have been living the way we do now would be so small you wouldn't even be able to get a measurement. You wouldn't even be able to tell what the measurement was on the ruler. So during all of that time, most of that time, survival was the main focus, and you had to stay focused on it in order to survive. So there's a really easy learning method there that's brought about by drama. I mean, if a mother can tell her children every day before they go to school, if they walk through the woods, to watch for bears. So after a while, they don't see any bears, they'll start not paying very much attention. One time a bear chases them up a tree, they'll never ever forget it and never have to be told again. So the point I'm trying to make here, I guess, Steve, in a convoluted way, is that learning is best achieved when we are capable of creating our own drama.
So let's connect that with the concept of purposeful learning and self-education, and maybe talk a little bit about, if you would, the stories we tell about learning in schools and how they might need to change for us to be doing a better job of becoming self-learners.
Yeah. Well, you can't. It's sort of hard to direct somebody to be self-directed. I mean, you have to. To me, the goal of the teacher is, like Emerson said, is to inspire. I mean, people. I mean, I have several years of schooling that I have no memories of at all, and I attribute that to the fact that they must have not been very, very successful. And I remember sometimes daydreaming and thinking that I had no interest in what I was talking about, and I was that way until my early 30s, and then I gradually began to become a little bit more interested until sort of at one point the pilot light was lit and it rages on. I'm never without a stack of books about 4 feet high, and I'm never without. I read 2 or 3 books a week and have for about 30 years now.
So the interesting conundrum there, or difficulty, is that the experiences that a lot of us have had in our own personal learning don't necessarily match up to the narratives that are told about learning in school. And the very structure of school, as you describe in the book, potentially leads people to believe that they have failed or are wounded or don't do well. How would you counterbalance that, or how would you suggest we might change things?
Well, I think you have to. The best way, how I would go about it, would be that the objective of the school was to build on strengths, to find out in each student what they are, and then sort of build outward. But there has to be enough autonomy to where a student is enabled to gain an intrinsic value from learning. I mean, if you have no control over the front page of your awareness for a long period of time, you just sort of shut it down, or at least I did. I think you have to achieve a critical mass of learning about any subject at such a point that when you add to it, and you add something significant to it, like I said before, you create your own drama. And that drama is an incredibly enthralling, cerebral event. For me it is anyway.
So, is there a way to connect or relate your call to action by the older September University cohort with how we think about formal schooling? I'm actually not sure I drilled down enough on that in my preparation to know if you would advocate homeschooling or unschooling or any other methodology.
Well, to me, Steve, whatever works. I mean, I think some students do very well with homeschooling. Some do well with the traditional education the way it is. But I know so many adults. I know so many people whose lives sort of move along without any real particular interest in anything. To the point of their curiosity is sort of cauterized, and a lot of people work at jobs that they don't particularly like. Some actually hate, and they trade off between working at that job and a little bit of mild entertainment, and they'd go for years like that without any real interest in anything, and they're just sort of almost doing time with no real curiosity. And it's, for the life of me, it's feeling the way I do about it now. I mean, I can relate to a time when I was a young adult, and I felt like that myself. But it's still so hard after you've changed so much to appreciate what that was like. And I think it's just one of the most frustrating things in the world that so many people are turned off to education.
So there's a temptation to kind of yearn for a previous period of time or a nostalgia around what things were like earlier. And clearly we're in a period of history when more people are going to need some form of education for employment than ever before. But you do point back to the 18th century in several instances as a period of time when there was a better understanding of this kind of active participation intellectually. And I think about the Federalist Papers and the level of understanding that was needed to be able to read those letters in the newspaper. So
right.
You want to kind of describe what you think was going on at that time?
Well, I think you'd have to harken back to the time when there was no media, there was no TV, there was no radio, and if you imagine a time like that, and there weren't that many books, but there were a lot of good books, and people spent an awful lot of time reading and talking. Now, I say a lot of people. There were still a significant percentage of the population in those days that were illiterate or semi-literate. But the people that did pursue knowledge, the people who were really interested in learning, look like giants today comparatively. Ralph Waldo Emerson made the lecture circuit for years and years and years, and his audience oftentimes didn't really understand what he was saying, but he treated them with such respect, as if they did, that they loved him for it. So it was only a percentage of the population who was really up to the Federalist Papers, I think. But there weren't in those days. You didn't have to have a credential in order to teach at a university. You had to have the knowledge, and if you had that, that was self-evident. And I think that fact alone would make such an incredible difference now if people knew that whatever that they learned, that they would be rewarded commensurately without, if they could demonstrate it without spending a fortune or going into debt to do. I think we would look at education very differently.
Yeah, I would love it if you'd talk a little bit about the credential piece, because that was very new to me. I really appreciated your perspective. And you, in fact, you yourself come from a little bit of a different background, right?
Yes. Well, I joined the Marines on my 17th birthday. Dropped out of high school, took a GED, and spent 4 years in the Marines. I came out and became a police officer in Dallas, Texas, for about 4 years. And it was after that time that I began to really became interested in learning and self-education. And I went to work in the early or in the late 70s for a major oil company, and not having a college education was a bit of a hindrance, but I learned to make up for it by demonstrating the competence to do whatever it is I was supposed to do, and I was hired into a management position. But I've sort of railed against credentialing most of my life. I mean, I don't do it so much anymore because I'll be 70 years old in March. So I mean, I'm retired, but when I was active, I was focused on it a lot. And to me, the credentialing the way we do it now, in so many instances, what it actually does is grandfather incompetence. A paper that says you can do this or that means nothing unless you can demonstrate it. And if you can demonstrate it, you don't need the paper. I mean, most jobs are learned on the job, even brain surgery.
You may not be aware that a very hot topic right now is badging. Is this risen to your awareness?
I'm sorry, Steve, I didn't understand.
Well, it's a movement to provide structure for people to issue badges, much like the Boy Scout program, but within education, so that things that typically haven't been recognized formally can be recognized. And there's a fairly strong contingent of people who really like the badging movement as a way of recognizing alternative learning or unique learning. But I worry that it's just more a system of external validation that misses the point of the manifestation of what you can do being what you can do.
I think you're probably right about that. I'm not familiar with badging, but I mean, I would tend to agree with what you said about it.
Okay, so I want to be careful here. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I do think that oftentimes we can explain things that happen historically based on interests of those who have the ability to further those interests. And the idea that you have a quote in the book from Kant, having the courage to use your own intelligence, it feels as though there are some groups, especially politically and economically, who've benefited from us not using our intelligence, from being sort of compliant consumers. Do you think that's fair?
Absolutely. I mean, they do depend on it. I mean, an uneducated citizenry is incredibly manipulable. I mean, in the last 30 years, there has been an awful lot learned in neuroscience and psychology, and some of it is so profound that it's really a shame that it's not common knowledge. I mean, for example, politically, we tend to, the areas in the brain light up when somebody touches our political hot buttons, and we tend to shut off the discourse. We tend to stop listening. We only listen for confirmation bias. And psychologically, you know, we grow up thinking that character is one thing, and that we're always consistent, and that our personality means this or that. And the truth of the matter is that context of the situation often matters a whole lot more than our personality and our temperament. And it's very disappointing to learn maybe that a psychologist could create a situation and know what you're going to do, and you wouldn't know it. And one of the easiest things to do is to manipulate people by touching their hot buttons. I mean, that's, you know, talk radio thrives on pushing hot buttons, and media itself, you know, even the television stations and talk shows and what have you. It's like beach volleyball. They spike the ball at every opportunity to keep us watching. And as long as they can touch that hot button, and we can become, you know, hostile to those people that we think are others, we are easily manipulable. We don't have I don't think we've ever been any more polarized than we are right now politically.
So I like an author named Dan Ariely, who wrote a book called Predictably Irrational, and he describes ways in which we make purchasing decisions, that something more expensive seems to be more valuable. And intriguingly for me, I call this the Ariely principle, but those are my words, not his. The awareness of this psychological process in many ways frees us from its influence. When we become aware that price often doesn't correlate to value, it ceases to actually affect us. You use a quote in the book from Postman. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, go ahead. I lost my train of thought anyway.
Well, you use a quote in the book from Neil Postman that education is a defense against one's culture, which I really liked. Mm-hmm. But I also feel as though education is a defense against our own sort of lesser natures.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with that 100%. But you know, every culture in the world thinks that theirs is the one that sort of hung the moon, and everybody else is just searching and hasn't found the real, true reality yet. And to me, as soon as a person realizes that intellectually, you should go reeling into introspection and think about your own culture and the things that are so arbitrary that you think are absolute, that are absolutes and are not. I mean, people can, you know, the old saying, the fewer the facts, the stronger their opinion. I mean, that nothing could probably capture the state of our political discussion right now. Is people, and I can remember being most adamantly argumentative when I knew very, very little about what I was talking about. I mean, what you have to do in that respect is default to your emotion and relate to your identity group. And when you're relating and not reasoning, then you have no choice but to become increasingly emotional.
That's, I think, what worried me so much about this particular election cycle. And I don't know if it was my own development or it was just this particular cycle, but I think a lot of us expected President Obama to act differently than he did. And some of the sort of most egregious, to me, this is personal opinion, things that have happened both through the last few presidencies really were unrecognized in the election. And I actually got kind of scared that the emotion was so powerful that it was not allowing us to see the dangers of, say, as an example, the issues around habeas corpus or around wiretapping. Is this dangerous to us as a culture?
I think so. I agree with you 100%.
Okay, I went pretty deep there, and I didn't get into trouble, or at least you didn't let me get into trouble.
It's that's a very dangerous area, and we can't seem to get it to make it a part of a media focus. I mean, you can bring it up and it just goes away. It goes away, and people don't seem to be interested in talking about it.
I actually think this was what I've liked most about the new movie Lincoln, was that it creates an opportunity for some pretty serious dialogue around the decisions that were made that where the ends justified the means. And at least with my own children, it allowed for a pretty rich discussion about what actually happens in politics.
Yeah, it burst a bit of the bubble about how much more honorable, I guess, they acted in those days. I saw the movie too, and I thought it was great. At one point during that movie, I caught myself thinking that I was really looking at Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, it was. I agree. It was, for me, a brilliant experience. Okay, so you talk about being able to see through the camouflage. So have we pretty much discussed that, or is there anything else you'd want to say that we need to be thinking about being able to see clearly?
I don't know. You have to. I mean, I don't know. Nothing right off the top of my head, Steve.
Why don't you talk a little bit about? Go ahead.
I always think about what I should have said when I hang up.
That's okay. What about consumer culture? I mean, that comes up in the book, obviously.
Well, I think we have gone so far down the road of consumer culture that materialism has become sort of a quasi-religion. I think probably perhaps more important than religion in some aspects and some culture, but I think we need to renew. I have started several actions in the past, but that never really went anywhere, trying to get media to stop calling us consumers and start calling us citizens. I think if the simple fact of doing that would make us more aware. I mean, a consumer doesn't do anything but consume.
Another point you make in the book that was kind of a fall out of my chair point for me, because it's one I've been making and felt very alone in making, was the degree to which we trade our ability to speak freely when we go to work for most companies.
Oh, absolutely, and the older I got, the more freely I spoke, to the point of being on dangerous ground a lot. But there is so much. One of the things I've been doing lately, I've been studying prehistory and have been studying the subject of anarchy. And most people, when you say the word anarchy, people think about people throwing Molotov cocktails and stuff. But the discipline of the subject of anarchy in anthropology, it just goes back to a time before there were hierarchies, or when there are tribes with no chiefs. And I don't think you can think about that for very long without starting to see the connection and the oppressive nature of almost any kind of an organization. I mean, organizations started for very noble purposes can still be oppressive, and with the best intentions in the world. And so, there's so many companies where, politically, I've always been. I mean, I grew up in a very conservative town, in a conservative family, and my self-education has turned me into a liberal. And imagine being a liberal in a major oil company. And imagine how rare that is. So, you just, there are so many different ways that we don't speak our minds, and when we should, and there are big consequences. I mean, there are incredible consequences, and they're hard to overestimate.
We drilled down on this a little in Yale Wishnick's interview. He wrote as a representative of the teachers union in California. He's a very interesting fellow who's gone back and looked at the founding of the country and concluded that this culture that sort of celebrated success that existed at that time has become a culture that depends on dependency now. Mm-hmm. And we talked about the roots of the word liberal and the idea of freedom. And somebody I'm intrigued with, Noam Chomsky, actually describes himself politically as an anarchist. I'm not sure I know what that means, but I do find it interesting that that you would say that. Okay, so I want to kind of, if we can, bridge a little to allow some Q&A, but also bridge a little to sort of solutions. Mm-hmm. And I'm really curious if you thought about the mechanisms that might be supported or encouraged that would provide for the great conversations of those who are in the September of their lives. How do we bring back the I'm trying to remember the word now, the Lyceum movement?
Well, there's an awful lot of it going on right now. I mean, the internet has never. I mean, there's never been as much possible. I mean, although I think the Chautauqua movement was great and wonderful. I mean, it doesn't hold a candle to what's going on right now, really. But we need to get the dialogue going and keep it going. I have great difficulty doing several things at once, and I keep getting bogged down in writing, and I haven't promoted September University like I should. I can't. When I focus on writing a new book, I get so worked into it that the time slips away from me. But I have a whole list of things to do in the book that people can do, and a number of them that I need to do better than I'm doing. I mean, I get so focused and tied up in my work that I just can't. Time slips away.
So I'm going to encourage people, if they'd like to ask a question, to either put it in the chat or feel free to raise your hand and I'll give you the microphone. And we'll move to the Q&A portion. While we're doing so, Charles, if you want to list some of the things that you think people could do, I think they would enjoy that. The audience is largely educators usually, okay. Many of whom are of an age probably close to what we're talking about.
Oh, I mean, I'm sorry. Say that again, Steve.
Oh, I think that there are those in the audience who would enjoy hearing a short list from you of things that you think people could do who fit into this category of being in the close to the September of their lives. And
okay. Well, you
could be making a difference.
Okay. Well, you could decide what you really care about and sort of discern the genealogy of your own values and try to comprehend why you value those things. You can perform an exhaustive internet search, following your own interest to find organizations dedicated to shaping the future, and let your strengths and personal interests be your guide. You can start your own September University chapter, seek out discussion groups and share your interest, look for opportunities to engage in civil dialogue, invite members of other groups to join yours, learn about the requirements for a sustainable future, and familiarize yourself with arguments of those who appear to oppose your views. join or visit groups who don't seem to share your values, and read the books you've always wanted to read. Study as if what you learn really matters.
There's some nice comments in the chat here. Carolyn, thanks both for the link and the compliment on the show. The funny part is, Charles, that this interview series really is my form of participating in learning. You can add to that list, start an interview series.
Yeah.
Okay, so Angie says, I would rather think of being in the senior category as the golden age of learning. We have the innate sense of need for clear educational thinking. We do care for the upcoming generations, but we also do not need to think we are incapable of continuing to learn ourselves. I would like to ask you, go ahead.
Right. Plus the fact that you have a lifetime of experience to compare with what you learn.
Yes. Sorry, just reading the chat there. Scott says, our college can't find mentors to help students. Their peers are too focused on loans and jobs. Can this be listening to others for advice gone out of style, plus the busy part?
Well, I'm not sure how to... Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the second part, but he's talking about the college can't find mentors to help students. The peers are too focused on loans and jobs.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Listening?
Yeah, I'm working on a novella at the moment entitled "The Call of Mortality." It's about an old philosophy professor who is retiring and taking a new young replacement out on an overnight camping trip in the Alaska wilderness. And one of the things this young man concludes at the end is to approach the land-grant universities with a volunteer group of volunteer philosophers to go around the country and start groups and help people understand themselves and others in conjunction with the mind, how the mind really works, and not how we grew up thinking it did.
Interesting. You've written fiction before, right?
Yes, I published a novel about 10 years ago called Portals in a Northern Sky, and I have a novella on Amazon called Pansy, Bovine Genius in Wild Alaska. It's about a genius cow in Alaska. It's really about post-modern.
I think you need to write a book about two horses. One wild and free up on the hill looking down at the one saddled and working on the farm.
Yeah. Well, I talked quite a bit in September University about a saddle horse what I call a saddle horse education.
There's some nuance there as well, though. As I was reading that, I thought, there are ways in which the partnership between man and beast can be beneficial to both. Uh-huh. And there are ways in which just being wild and not ordered or disciplined can be a negative. Does that particular imagery actually allow for some deeper thinking?
Yeah, I think so. And like I said before, if you focus and just start thinking about what life must have been like with tribes without chiefs. I mean, that's a profound thought when you get to thinking about it, and you get to thinking about all the different organizations, the local city and state and borough and county and company and how all of those things affect your life. And I mean, it's really enlightening to do that. I really encourage it. I mean, the people that talk to us about anarchy and stuff, you know, I've always been sort of turned off by that. I mean, you know, you just, the image you have is people riding in the streets, but that's not where they're really coming from at all. They're just talking about a life lived with as little alienation as possible, as little hierarchy as possible, and even though so many organizations have noble intentions and they're founded on noble efforts, they can become oppressive very easily, and we have a very significant portion of the population of people who, in my view, are way too easy to manipulate.
So, are you familiar with Ivan Illich's work, Deschooling Society?
Oh, Illich? Oh, yes, I am. Yes,
correct.
Yes, I sure am.
I'm not sure that I actually fully understand him, but I do feel there's an argument being made that oftentimes institutions end up creating the opposite of what they were designed to do.
Yep, yeah, they sure do. And the you know, the function is always to protect the institution over the individual. That seems to be where it always goes. And hierarchies become self-reinforcing and rigid. I mean, you always have to toe the company line and protect the organization at all cost. I mean, and you know, organizations, you know, government organizations do not disassemble. They keep growing, and they keep growing and growing and growing. And they can be founded on the most noble intentions and get completely out of hand.
We probably have time for one final question if somebody has a question. Jenny's asking what others think about chartered schools. Charles, do you have an opinion on the charter school movement?
Well, I think I have read about some of them that seem fairly successful, but I don't think they're fundamentally any different than any other kind of organization. They are simply an organization, and if they have the right intention, I mean, if they have to use the right technique and they focus on the student and help that student become inspired and excited about something, I don't see why they can't be successful, same as a homeschooler or what have you. But I don't have any special feelings for them.
I do notice that a lot of chartered schools actively involve teachers and parents in their creation, and that's an aspect I have really appreciated, although I know that's not universal. Mm-hmm. There's a discussion in the chat about money and the focus changing as soon as the car loan payments start. Scott says, there's a lot in this book, September University, that I think people would find very interesting in that regard. You call it the thrall of money, mm-hmm. And I think it relates to the consumer culture. Any final thoughts on that, maybe as our closing remark?
Well, I think, you know, I mean, we hear it constantly. We say it. We hear everybody say it. And we agree that the education is one of the most important things in the world, and yet we make it so expensive that a person almost has to engage in indentured servitude in order to become educated. I mean, you know, in a college or university, it makes no sense. To me, if education is what we need, we ought to make it, if not free, at least very, very affordable. And I think the current system is going to crumble of its own weight in the future if it doesn't do that. You know, the student loan debt right now is higher than credit card debt in this country, and that can't sustain itself, especially if people graduated from college can't find a job that's for which they can pay off the loan.
Right, and it certainly predisposes one to taking a job that reduces one's liberty to say or do the things that you want to do. Absolutely,
absolutely. And that's when thinking about that, thinking about what life would be like without hierarchy, it's really a profound thing if you focus on it long enough.
Charles, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
It's really been delightful. So we've been talking with Charles Hayes. The book is September University, Summoning Passion for an Unfinished Life, a call and a challenge to those who are in the September of their lives to be active participants in helping to build our world. Coming up on Thursday, Jim Groom will talk about a domain of one's own. Thanks, Charles.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for being here. Really appreciate the very good conversation and the dialogue in the chat. Take care now, and goodbye.